Welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle, and welcome in particular to any listeners who've joined us recently. Over the last few weeks, we've seen a really big spike in our numbers, which is awesome. So for anyone who's joining the show, welcome. Thanks for tuning in. Every week we have conversations like this where my goal is to bring you something really engaged and in-depth with a really interesting guest, and often to have conversations that are challenging and counterintuitive, and to push around your intuitions on what's moral or what's just. So, if that sounds interesting, there's lots of ways to like and subscribe. Please do check out the website, politicalphilosophypodcast.com. And for returning listeners, welcome back as well. As always, if you're enjoying the show, you can support it through Patreon at whatever level is right for you. And it's also really valuable to us forever who just shares an episode on their own social media, helps get the word out there. So, my guest today is Professor Tamler Sommers, who many of you will know from the Very Bad Wizards podcast, which, if you haven't checked it out, is a really awesome, funny, but also very engaged and very in-depth series of conversations about politics, ethics, psychology, stuff like that. And this will be the first of a two-part series. So this is the first half of my conversation with Tamler. The second half will be out next week. And this is a format I'm increasingly getting into for bringing the show to you. It allows us to have longer conversations, but in a way that you can process them as a viewer in digestible chunks. I took to social media to ask for feedback, and this seemed to be the preferred option for how we do the show going forward. One final note is, in this conversation, I reference a number of other conversations I've had on the podcast. We're up to 25 episodes now, so it's almost getting to be like a body of work now, which is kind of crazy. And if you look at the webpage for this episode, I'll provide a short introduction to and a link to the episodes that I've referenced in this conversation. So, getting straight to today's guest. Tamler Sommers is a professor at the University of Houston. His research and writing revolves around issues of honor, free will, moral responsibility, punishment, and revenge. He's the author of several books, including Relative Justice and A Very Bad Wizard, Morality Behind the Curtain. And he's just published Why Honor Matters, which becomes the basis for the first part of our conversation today. Also, as mentioned, he's the co-host of the Very Bad Wizards podcast, along with psychologist David Pizarro. In the first part of this conversation, we discuss Tamler's podcast and his overall approach to controversy, and then we really zero in on just one aspect of his latest book, that of collective responsibility and collective punishment. So, without further preamble, it's my pleasure to bring you Professor Tamler Sommers. All right, let's just go. So I am joined here today by Tamler Sommers. Tamler, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me.
Great. So I think a lot of people will have already heard you from your podcast, but for those who haven't, how do you answer the always awkward question, what do you do?
Well, just by the most straightforward way possible. I teach philosophy at the University of Houston, and I have a podcast. That is pretty much what I do. I'm the author of a few books. I have tenure, so I have a certain degree of freedom right now, which has allowed me to do some more offbeat projects. And although I guess I was doing some of those before tenure too. So But now I can do it more easy of mind.
Yeah, so yeah, tenure might be a good starting point for launching something like Very Bad Wizards. And
Right. We were happy to, yeah, we had both just gotten tenure, Dave and I think, right around the first or second episode. And once we got it, we both realized, we can say whatever dirty jokes, inappropriate jokes we want. And it's not that they can't fire us, but it would be a Byzantine legal hassle to fire us.
Have you ever got any blowback? I remember the last Very Bad Wizards episode I listened to had some, good old-fashioned bestiality jokes in it. Have you ever got any blowback from it in your sort of professional department life?
Surprisingly, none. Just none at all. At first, I think it was because people just didn't know about it, but we've gotten surprisingly little blowback, period. And, we've had some episodes where we're really pushing the boundaries of what's considered acceptable. And I don't know, there's something about a podcast where they get to know the hosts, and I think if people believe that the hearts are in the right, that our hearts are in the right place, then we can get away with a lot that other people couldn't necessarily get away with. In the same way that, South Park, I think, gets away with a lot of stuff that others wouldn't. And that's because people suspect that Trey Parker and Matt Stone are at heart good people with good intentions. And I think that's, even in today's charged environment, or what people say is a charged environment, you have a lot of flexibility and freedom as long as you're not a dick, as long as you're not an asshole, as long as you're not really racist or, really sexist.
Also, I get the feeling, even with South Park, I think there's sometimes a sort of Marilyn Manson effect where they're just trying to get a rise out of people. I never get that feeling. I mean, maybe you are with Very Bad Wizards. I get the feeling you're saying it because you think it's funny. You're not going to provoke a reaction. You're going because you just think it's fun stuff to play around with. Yeah.
I actually kind of read South Park that way too, but yes, sometimes, but I think so. For something like Family Guy seems to me to be a better description of what you were talking about, of trying to get a rise out of people. South Park, undeniably has some episodes where they're doing that. Like when there's a bomb in Hillary Clinton's vagina or something like that. But no, I mean, I think they're at heart just trying to make themselves laugh and trying to make people laugh. And that's what we do on the podcast too. And and I think those kinds of things come across. And when people react against comics or professors, there's usually something else behind it than some remark they made or some insensitive joke or something. There's more to it, as in my experience in academia for the last 15 years.
Yeah, it wasn't the topic we meant to discuss, but you and Dave are both on record as you think the reaction against political correctness on campuses is a little bit overblown. It's not that people don't ever act like idiots, it's just not our central concern about what's happening, right?
Yeah, it's much more. I think the internet gives a radically distorted picture of what's going on college campuses, and because there are these incidents where students are spoiled and coddled and everything that, snowflakes, and they're complaining about microaggressions. There are these cases, but it happens even at the sort of liberal arts, rich private institutions where these things tend to happen. Even at those institutions, it happens much more seldom than people think. And, people forget with Charles Murray, and there was that, truly bad incident at Middlebury, but Charles Murray's been giving talks at campuses for the last 10, 15 years. Even, he had some reaction after the bell curve, and then that died down. And you just never hear about the times where everything goes smoothly. We hosted him at U of H, and there were a couple little protests, but nothing disruptive. Everything within the bounds of sort of fair and what you should expect. And everything went off without a hitch. And that's because you only see the Middleburys or the Evergreen States. You think, oh, this is what's going on these campuses. Everyone's afraid. No, there's a chilling effect. I can say honestly that I don't and never have felt chilled. Not at my university, not when I'm giving talks at other universities. It's just not that phenomenon, I think, is something that people project onto college campuses, including some professors. They say, oh, I'm afraid to say something. Well, sometimes it's just because they're being pussies. Like
Yes.
they should sit. If they truly believe something and they're not just trying to get a rise out of somebody, then they should say it and see what happens.
There's also a level of hypocrisy in that people accuse the college left or the far left or the social justice warriors or whatever you want to call them of being oversensitive and overreactive, which I don't doubt some of them are. But then the reaction to that perceived overreaction is in itself such an overreaction that it's and you're calling people snowflakes, whereas the minute they maybe hold a protest against a speaker they think is a racist or something, you lose your mind.
Right.
Like you're projecting.
And then you say, I can't say anything now because I'm afraid that people will call me a racist. And that's just now you're being the snowflake.
Exactly. So, talking of ideas that, how shall we say, could be potentially problematic, shall we jump in and say some stuff that may offend people on both sides of that divide?
Sure. Yeah.
that was as awkward a segue as I've ever done.
This book that I just did, so it got a review in the Atlantic where they're, very much from the left complaining about how much I underestimate how honor has contributed to, the Trump and the alt-right. And then there was a review in the Washington Times that complained that I was too squishy. I was too much of a squishy liberal. So I've really managed to do something that pleases nobody.
So I did have this question for you. To start with, honour's quite a difficult concept to nail down to begin with, like in almost just like a Wittgensteinian sense. It's not so much like, here is what honour is in a definition. There's more just a set of like recurring themes you tend to find in honour cultures, right? But then, so my question was, how do you see honour as a concept relating to the political spectrum? Because at a first glance, it feels conservative or right-wing, but then a lot of the places you go with it in terms of criminal justice reform, immigration, stuff like that, would seem at least stereotypically left-wing. So I realise I'm asking you to map one very big vague thing onto another very big vague thing, but to the extent that you can, how would you see honour as relating to the political left or the political right?
Yeah, it's really hard, and I don't think it fits comfortably in either category. I mean, there are elements of honor cultures that I think map on surprisingly well to feminist philosophy, ethics of care, a kind of philosophy that doesn't rely on universal, abstract, ideal principles, but on relationships and the connection you feel with people in your family and people in your group. That's a theme in feminist philosophy, which is definitely associated with the left wing. But then there's also this distrust of centralized authority, a kind of emphasis on the local, and a emphasis on standing up for yourself and not turning to third parties to handle your own conflicts. You handle them yourselves. I think that people associate more with the right. Honestly, I think in a country like the United States, honor isn't part of politics for sure. I mean, if there's a group of people that I can say don't act honorably, it would be politicians. Ted Cruz endorsed the man who called his wife ugly and said his father assassinated JFK.
That video of Ted Cruz making calls for Trump was like... It was like a self-inflicted hostage video. It was just sort of beautiful and horrifying to watch at the same time. I
mean, he has an election coming up right now, and I think if I was the candidate, Beto O'Rourke, who's running against him, I would just say, Ted Cruz endorsed the man who called his wife ugly and accused his dad of murdering JFK.
Yeah,
I'm Beto O'Rourke, and I approve this message. Like that,
I can see that being compelling to a Trump voter.
That's
who does that?
Who does that exactly? So that's just something about politicians. I don't understand it. I don't understand why they don't act. I think voters would respect somebody standing by principles, but maybe I'm wrong about that. I'm not a pollster. But I also think that the United States is so big and so diverse that it's hard to imagine the kind of honor values and honor communities that I'm sort of trying to defend or explore. It's hard to imagine how it could really work at such a scale, right? So most of my examples in the book are on much smaller scales. There's sports teams, military units, smaller subcultures within the larger society. I think that's where honor frameworks and honor values are more effective than at the larger level. Except when something like 9/11 happens or something, and that inspires people to feel connected, not just to their family members or the people in their group or their party or whatever, but to the entire country. But those things are so rare that I think normally people are identifying with something much smaller than an entire nation.
So one aspect of honor that I think is going to be both intuitive and unintuitive is the focus on the group and the group identity and your investment in that, in a way that seems to run afoul of a lot of our professed liberal convictions. In a way, though, one intuitive way in would be to draw a very clear analogy between codes of honour and a lot of the behaviour of the social justice types that we just started with, is the ability to respond to an insult to the group. Like when the quintessential like case of honour would be someone says "fuck your mother" and you punch them on the nose, right?
Yeah.
But then,
or Zidane's headbutt,
right?
Yeah.
Well, that was about his sister, right? Like, would never have insulted his mother.
No, if as the Italian wants to make very clear, it wasn't about his mother; it was about his sister.
But then it seems like there's not a clear, bright divide between that and like the philosophy of microaggressions, which is you've cast a slur or an aspersion on my national identity or my racial identity, and I feel empowered to call you down on that and like respond on behalf of a group. Does that make sense as an analogy? You must have got that question.
Actually, not really, but it's a good question. I think so. Sometimes when people complain about microaggressions, it's a microaggression against them. One sort of frustrating thing, and I can identify with people who are up in arms about the SJWs, is when sort of a white person feels offended on behalf of a black person, or offended on behalf of a woman, or and especially in cases where the black person might not be offended. And but there's a difference. And there was a paper that came out, and I had a lot of problems with this paper, but it was called The Culture of Victimhood. I forget who the authors were, but the idea was that these groups, the groups that you're referring to, they share one component with honor cultures, which is they have a heightened sensitivity to insult. So that's the component that they share with honor cultures. They're easily offended, they feel easily insulted, and they feel that some response is owed. But the difference is they turn to the administration or some impartial authority as a form of punishment, a Title IX court or something like that. Whereas in an honor culture, you wouldn't do that. You would handle it yourself. And so and I think here is where I think, and I don't know to what extent that's a fair characterization. Again, I don't really run into these people who are supposedly constantly insulted and offended.
I work for a bunch of hyper-liberal causes, so I meet the real-life version of the cutout. Actually, I would say, to the contrary, that there actually is a sense of taking personal responsibility for it. Not necessarily exclusively, but I think there is a case in social justice culture of feeling empowered by personally saying, don't you realise what you just said is racist? And that there's actually a sense of wanting to do it yourself. I think that is there, actually, sometimes.
Well, so to the extent that it is, I respect that. If a student comes up to me after class and says that I've insulted or offended her race or her group, or and wants to talk to me about it, and I can ask questions as to what I did and why exactly that's how discourse should work. I think, again, in some of the cases, it's more that they call someone out on Twitter, or they go to the administration and ask that the person be suspended. So that's not honor culture way of handling it. But to confront the person seems absolutely, I think we need a lot more of that, because then you have people talking to each other and not people just trying to shame each other or
I literally just got off the phone with Teresa Bejan, who's an Oxford professor of political theory, and this was her conclusion, is that it's actually very valuable to the extent that you're creating a conversation as opposed to shutting one down.
Right.
And I made the same point with Kellyanne Mendoza, who's a former field director of Amnesty International, where we did a whole podcast arguing that most of the social justice concepts are completely valid. It's a question of when someone does say something racist, do you say, well, hey, let me try and explain this to you, or even to just ask questions like, why do you feel that way? Yeah. As opposed to just going, well, fuck you, you're a racist, end of conversation. That seems correct to me.
Yeah, and then correspondingly on the other side, you shouldn't shut down if somebody complains that, you said something racist and you don't think you did. You should at least, you have a responsibility, within boundaries, to engage with that person too and ask why they feel that way. and what it is that you did. You don't even have to end up agreeing, but I think there's also a lot of people who will shut down on that end. Our podcast has been very good for this. We every once in a while, not from other academics, but from just listeners, will say that will send us an email that not complain is the wrong word, but just wants to let us know that what we said was offensive to them, or they felt they were uncomfortable with it, and we engage with that person, and it's almost always a positive engagement.
Yeah. I completely agree. And I think that people are too quick to dismiss all of social justice work as the sort of closing down conversation. Whereas actually there's a lot of really good people doing good work in a sort of, I want to talk to you about this, I want to draw your attention to it. One, though, other dividing line you could draw in terms of the sort of responding to insult and so on is the idea of feeling responsibility for the group. Like in social justice, you may well want to respond to a negative assertion about all black people or something, but you wouldn't want to be held responsible for the bad behaviour of people within that group. Whereas a big part of honour culture that I read you as saying is that if you are going out for a sports team, say, you are representing that team, and that there is a sense of collective responsibility that you absolutely wouldn't want for, say, a racial grouping, right?
Yeah, I think again a racial group is too large and too diffuse to have the kind of connection and relationship where you feel responsible for what the other what people just of your race have done. I mean, it definitely happens. In the book, my earlier book, Relative Justice, I led off that book with just a description of this NPR program I heard right after the killings at Virginia Tech, where it was a mass shooting done by a Korean student. He shot and killed 32 people. And this reporter on NPR was interviewing people in the Korean Americans in LA, and asking them how they felt about what happened. And they were they were very uncomfortable talking to her, and when they did talk, they said they felt so ashamed, and they felt like they had to apologize for what this person did. And then even Korean American leaders called for a public apology on behalf of the Korean American community, and even proposed that they atone by fasting one day for every victim that was killed. And it was funny. The NPR reporter found that so baffling. He was like, "But wait a minute, you didn't know this person. You're 3,000 miles away. Why do you feel responsible for this at all?"
Could you not think of an example for yourself? I'm going to push back on this a little. I think so. Clearly, like the idea of like representing the group well is a very powerful one, and is a very powerful regulator of behaviour. So that would certainly work for, like, don't let the side down in a sports team. But I'm also just thinking, I'm a Brit living in America. Both the British and the Americans have reputations as being lousy tourists. That we go over to other countries, we don't understand their culture, the British get drunk and get in fistfights, right? Yeah. I'm very conscious when I'm abroad to not be the either the American dork tourist who doesn't understand the history, or the British tourist making a mess of it, and that's probably a regulator of my behaviour in some way, right?
Yeah, and in a positive way, right? You don't want to be that kind. You don't want to conform to that to that stereotype, but it's often an accurate stereotype, and you don't. And I think what would go along with that, and I don't know if you feel like this, is if you feel ashamed when you see a British person acting in the way that you don't want to act.
I might feel more compelled to try and regulate not just my behavior, but theirs.
Right. And that's one of the positive things with collective responsibility is it builds this sense of self-policing within the group. So if you feel responsible not just for what you do, but what people in your group do, and you feel and maybe other groups might think that you are an appropriate target of punishment or response, then you're gonna want to make sure that the people behave in appropriate ways who are in your group, and that can be a healthy, positive aspect if the things that you are trying to regulate are themselves morally positive.
So let me give you another example then, where you've got the exact same mechanic and it's also leading to good outcomes, but it just feels much more iffy. So I was, what was I doing? I was getting some pizza with a friend who happens to be older black woman, and that'll become pertinent in a sec. And this guy comes up to us and is just acting like a complete jackass. He's a black guy. He was just embarrassing us and himself, and we had to just leave eventually, right? And she said to me, yeah, I'll tell you, Toby, I hate it when I see black people behaving that way, because I know there's white people judging all of us. And well, I mean, in a sense, that's leading her, she's regulating her behaviour, or it's at least a force that would regulate her not to be a jackass, so that's positive. But it just feels much more unfair and unreasonable in the case of race, as opposed to, national identity.
And I think it especially feels unfair because of the history of race in this particular country, and how black people feel like they're never going to be given the benefit of the doubt. And so the reason that she feels that way, I think this drove a lot of, what people call respectability politics too, is this conviction that unless we comport ourselves perfectly, then we will be judged harshly in a way that other white people that white people wouldn't be, and that's probably accurate, and I think that's what makes it unfair, not necessarily the collective responsibility part of it, but more the reasons why that your friend feels ashamed when she sees another black person doing this, because she knows that's just gonna confirm what many white people unfairly suspect already.
Right. There's a inequity in that it's not the case for white people that we really feel that sense of responsibility, so it feels unfair that someone else should for basically the same.
I think there was somebody on a philosophy blog who said it's unfair that if you look at minority professors and you look at white professors dress like college students.
Right.
Whereas
that is so bloody true. Yeah.
Yeah. And the minority professors are much more, and women too, to some extent, are much more likely to dress in a more professional way. And that's a little unfair. And they were even calling for the white professors to also dress like that, so that this inequity was not allowed to continue. And I don't know if as one of those dress like a college student professors, I don't know if I go that far to endorse it, but I think they're pointing to something that reflects the kind of inequity that you're talking about, that the students will be less likely to respect a minority, or maybe a female in some fields, a female professor, if they're not dressed in a professional way, whereas a white person can get away with it.
Yeah, but though that there are inequities would apply to many, maybe even all spheres of collective responsibility, right? Because like the expectations you have as an American would be different than as a Mexican, right? Like the stereotypes you're responding to would be different. And even with the case of like sports teams, like they have a reputation and they're going to be concerned to either live up to or to defy that expectation in certain ways. So it's never going to be the case that collective responsibility is evenly applied across comparable groups.
That's right. Yeah. And even and these inequities is not always a reason to bemoan this sense of collective responsibility. I think collective responsibility, collective punishment, can be a positive force in some contexts and a negative one in some contexts. And really, I don't think there's underlying general principles that can let us know what those contexts are. It's much messier and more particularistic than that.
You think we've just got to sort of do what we're doing now and just sort of feel them out and just see what feels right?
Right. I mean, there's paradigmatic cases, I think, in the NHL or the Navy SEALs, that sense of collective responsibility seems like a force for good. And then in other cases, I don't know if this is a paradigmatic bad case, but maybe the Crips and the Bloods or something like that, which is that sense of collective responsibility and collective punishment has led to a lot of bloodshed, a lot of murders.
Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
No, but I mean, it's not even that is not maybe necessarily a clear-cut case, because there's a lot of positive that comes from gangs. But on all things considered, it is probably bad that if a blood feels like they have to avenge another blood's death by going after just any Crip, that's probably a recipe for a cycle of violence that can spin out of control.
Let's maybe revisit what you see as the positives of gangs. But I've got like just a pure philosopher's question, which it seems like the standard you're using to assess whether or not this is an appropriate case of collective responsibility is a morally consequentialist one. In other words, you could have a coherent worldview which is utilitarian, or you're just looking at what has the most positive consequences. You're not incorporating, say, retribution as a valid means for punishment. You're just looking at prevention and deterrence. And then it just becomes a purely empirical question of, is bad behaviour better deterred by individual or collective punishment in any given instance? That's a coherent worldview, but I think a lot of people would find it suspect.
Yeah, and I'm one of those people. I don't see myself as defending a consequentialist or utilitarian perspective on this issue. I think consequentialist considerations matter, for sure. I think there are that's something that needs to be weighed when giving an all things considered evaluation of a sense of something as complex as a sense of collective responsibility. But I'm more likely to see this in terms of from a perspective of virtue ethics. To take a much smaller example, I think me feeling pride in my daughter's accomplishments, me feeling shame and a sense of I need to make amends if she does something bad, that's a virtuous character trait to have. That's a part of the recipe for a good life, is to feel this sense of collective or a sense of a connection with family members, and whether or not it is optimal from the utilitarian standpoint, I still think it is a good thing, and it is part of living a good and virtuous life. So that's how I'm more likely to look at it more in terms of, is this what a good person would feel, or is this how a good person would behave? Now, that said, part of what goes into making that assessment will be consequentialist considerations. And sometimes consequentialist considerations can outweigh what it would. So maybe it is virtuous in some sense to feel like you want to retaliate on behalf of a murdered member of your gang, or or your friend or whatever. Maybe that's virtuous in some way, but still, all things considered, is something that we want to discourage for consequentialist reasons. But I definitely separate those two things, and I don't think consequentialist considerations are the only considerations, or that they always should win in a all things considered evaluation.
Yeah, I mean, there's another piece you could bring in, which is sort of like a Kantian prohibition on means and ends. So, I mean, the way you're talking, though, I think Sam Harris made this point to you when you did the Waking Up podcast, is you could process both of those as just two different sets of consequences, right? You could say there's the consequence of, does me having these particular carrots and sticks mentally, is that overall leading to more utility in the world? Then there's also the case of, on the inside, is my life more enriched by me having these feelings about a daughter or a family member? Is my life personally more valuable? But you could map both of those to like a big conception of welfare or flourishing or something like that. But then I think a lot of people would want to make the move to say, even if you have a big conception of welfare, the idea of collective punishment runs afoul of the idea that you treat people as ends in themselves, and there's something just a bit off deontologically, even if it maximizes value in the broad sense, about holding someone accountable for the actions of another. I mean, if you take a really extreme case, if you did, as I think Trump recommended this, if you were to execute the families of terrorists, they could well say to you, but on what right do you punish me for something I had no control over? So there's a sort of like abstract sense of value, which I'm not sure I personally find convincing, but I think a lot of people would want to make that move at this point, right?
Yeah, well, certainly. And, the whole retributivist theory of punishment is focused on this idea of individual responsibility, and even more narrowly, responsibility for what the individual has control over. I think, again, I think this is the real thesis of my book, Relative Justice. I think that perspective, that intuition, is something that is a recent development in human history. It is very culturally local. It has arisen in the West. I think it has ties to Christianity, but also in the kind of Kantian Enlightenment overall framework, ethical framework, and we sometimes mistake that perspective, these intuitions that we have inherited, and as universal rational truths, when they're just not. I don't think they can be defended rationally, and I think there are equally rational and sometimes morally there's morally advantageous other ways of viewing responsibility. And so again, I think I think it really depends on the context, and it depends on the culture, and it depends on the particular situation. And I would resist making a broad statement one way or the other. I think sometimes that this idea of holding only individuals responsible for their actions is a good thing. And sometimes it's a good thing to hold families responsible. Now, the Trump thing, I don't know why he said that or I don't know why he says anything, but my guess is he had in mind some kind of deterrent. If I had to guess, some sort of deterrent aspect. He didn't think it was justice. He thought if people knew their families were going to get killed, then they wouldn't do it. But I don't know. Or maybe he's just trying to fire up his base.
No, I mean, if you were to attempt to put a logical rationale behind it, it would be deterrence, right? And I ask that, I mean, I recently had on the podcast who's like a free will skeptic, doesn't believe in responsibility in any sort of retributive sense.
Yeah. Right.
And is just sort of working from what did he call it? But like if someone has an infectious disease, you'd want to quarantine them, and it's not about them as a person, it's just consequentialism. Which I actually am very sympathetic to that view on the grounds of like epistemic confidence. We can have a lot of confidence that suffering is real and that consequences matter, and anything else can just feel a bit more abstract. But then taking that view, if it were the case, and it surely can't be, that terrorists could be deterred by killing their families, that was the world we're living in, then it would become justified. And then the move he made to get out of that was the sort of Kantian prohibition on means and ends. But it would follow, if you don't view that move as valid, the means and ends distinction, or you think it's only sort of one side of the story, where's your purchase to be skeptical of collective punishment in that very extreme case?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. I don't think you can strike that balance. I think when consequentialists try to, and I guess this isn't what Greg was doing, but when they try to fudge the numbers so that what seems just and fair just happens to also be what will produce the best consequences, that's when I find the position to be not just implausible, but dishonest almost.
Thank you for listening to the Political Philosophy Podcast. In the second part of this conversation, I'll take up the challenge that Tamler threw down at the end of this episode and defend what I see as the value of moral consequentialism or utilitarianism or something like that, and I'll offer some arguments in defense of that approach, and Tamler will talk about his overall view of virtue ethics and what he sees as the value of moral philosophy, and we'll get into a discussion about what it is we're trying to do here in general. And that's a really valuable conversation that impacted me, so I hope you'll come back to join us for that. As always, if you do enjoy this show and find it valuable, we suggest a donation of $2 per episode. So if you found the episode you just listened to had equal value to, say, a cup of coffee, then it would be amazing if you'd support it on that basis. We have a Patreon site. It's really easy to do, so please do check that out. You can also support the show by sharing, tagging friends, anything to get the word out there. And as always, a big, big thank you to everyone who does either of those two things. Genuinely, you make the show possible. Apart from that, thanks again for listening, and I hope you'll return for part 2.